Hello and welcome to the Six Sales podcast. This is Mike Nicholson from Six Sales. Today we're going to be speaking to Kara Osborne, the CEO of UK and Ireland at Kara, how are you?
I'm good.
Good. Welcome. Looking forward to our conversation today. So just to kick us off, as is traditional, could you perhaps give us a bit of an overview of your career to date, maybe starting with your first job in media and bringing us up to date to your current role as CEO at for those that don't know, have been living under a rock or something, maybe tell us what do.
Yeah, I would love to. So as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from the UK originally. So I grew up in Michigan, and that is actually where I started my first media job. Before media, I was in marketing and sales, all on client side or publishing. And I kind of fell into media. So I interviewed.
I think everyone does.
Yeah. It was right after Kara had won the General Motors account, and which was an unexpected surprise, I think, for the entire agency world at that point. And they were setting up an office in Detroit. I was looking for a new role as an analyst because I was into data and analytics and customer insight. And it was a bit mad at that time where I interviewed in the morning. I got offered the role in the afternoon, which is quite an interesting experience. I got really lucky in that at that moment in time, GM was moving their account from Publicis at the time into Kara, which was the first time they'd done it in 20 years. So we had this opportunity to do everything all over again. So that account probably shaped my career more than any other role, where we had to set up what does good look like and how do we take an automotive brand and set up their data and infrastructure and their analytics. And I found this really amazing sweet spot between working with clients and data and technology and analytics and what you could do on an account if you get to start from zero. So I set up a team. So when I started on the account, I was one of 3 analysts. When I left, I had built that team to about 28 FTEs that were looking at everything from reporting through to advanced modeling and really driving the client's performance around data. And after about doing that for, maybe 4 years, I started being included in pitches and looking at how could you take that solution and potentially do it for other clients. So I got loads of pitching experience in Pitchpalooza in the United States in 2015, and was lucky enough to pitch on the Procter & Gamble account and really test that theory of, did we get it right? Like this model that we'd built on General Motors. And we did. Mark Pritchard loved it and said, yes, I think it's the right thing. And that has that basis of analytics and data and how you make better decisions. Because I think every client really wants to know how are you making the best decision possible at every step of the process. And the agency teams want to know, how do I prove value to the clients? And so when you have that common shared language of data, it makes such a big difference. So I became really passionate about this topic because I could see it no matter what the brief was from the client. If you had that data foundation, it made a difference in the relationship. So if I fast forward a little bit, I was given the opportunity to come and start up a global product organization within Dentsu. So I had a mentor at the time, Nigel Morris, who was one of the leaders within what was Dentsu Aegis, now Dentsu, who said, why don't you come and set up this department? You have a clear vision of what we could do with data and how that could come together. So what's the timelines on that, Kara? What sort of time was that? That was 5 years ago. Okay. 6 years. No, 6 years ago at this point. So I came in and this hadn't been done. Dentsu was just on that start of that transformation journey that they've been on over the past few years. And I set up a team from scratch, built a business case, presented to the board, and then started saying, how do we fix the challenges that agencies are faced with? So agencies are the translator between the marketplace and the client needs. And not a lot of tech is actually built for agencies. It's generally built to facilitate a sale, or it's built for a marketer to understand their consumer, not for that translation in the middle. So it was looking at how do we build translation between the marketplace and the consumer. So did that for 5 years, and incredibly rewarding, but at a global functional level, not in the weeds with agencies and clients on a day-to-day basis, which is what I loved about my time at on the General Motors account. And so after about 5 years and delivering a lot of really amazing things, I got the opportunity to go lead and think about how do you shape an agency, not just from a consulting perspective, but how do you embed data and analytics and technology usage at the heart. And I'm 6 months in and absolutely loving it.
Amazing. Could I take you back to that first job? Because
Yeah.
GM, not a bad first
Not
stab.
at all. Yeah.
and second, you were interviewed in the morning and got the job in the afternoon. I think it's not untypical now to interview over a 6 week, 8 week period and have 5 interviews. That's a hell of a hiring window, that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's. I think there was a mad dash at the time to staff up a team because at the time they had won the account, but there was no footprint. There was no office in Detroit. And so it was how many people can we get convinced to move from New York to Detroit, and then how can we staff up the remainder from a team in Detroit? And there were caps on how many employees from the last agency could come to the new agency. So it was quite a complex thing. I definitely believe a bit more rigor should have happened, but it was an interesting time in 2012.
It worked out well for them and you, right?
Yeah, it did, and it was one of those situations that probably if I had had time to think about it and spend more time thinking, oh, do I really want to do this? I might not have taken the job, but because it was, oh, this sounds exciting. I don't know a lot of what's going on, but yeah, this could work. And so coming from what I would say would be relatively mature industry, so automotive, telecom, publishing, industries that are very, very mature operationally, and coming into a media agency, which if you look at the operational curve of media agencies probably aren't as advanced as clients' businesses. I think it was such a learning experience for me to say, how can you take some of that rigor that lives in our client's business and apply some of it to agencies, but we need the innovation and creativity. You need a bit of the messiness. That's where you find new innovative ways to do things, I think.
Yeah. And was that fairly early on? I'm just trying to get my timelines correct, but was that fairly early on in what we came to know and love as big data?
Yeah, it was pretty early. So, I mean, that would have been 2012. So obviously search was around. There was, ad servers and things, but we really hadn't gotten into this world of taxonomy. How should you set up your campaigns? How should you set up your data that allows you to then not only report and optimize in campaign, but do modeling in the future? So I learned some very big lessons early on around how to structure data. And it's funny because when I talk about it in pitches or with clients, no one really gets excited about taxonomy. That sounds super boring. But actually, it makes a big difference in what you can and can't analyze in your data and what you can and cannot do with optimization. So I made loads of mistakes in that first role where I was like, okay, we're going to set up the data like CRM data. We'll just map the media data like I've done in prior lives with CRM, which doesn't quite work because media is all about scale and making big decisions and big bets, not just following a single person around the internet anymore. So it was trial and error, and I was lucky that I had real partnership from the clients. So we had clients who wanted to do really big, amazing things, and they were willing to give us some grace in the mistakes that we made. And so I think at one point we probably had 300 different variables that we were capturing in taxonomies, in addition to what we would get from the media vendors, which is way too much. We'd overcomplicated our lives. So it's much simpler than that, I think, once you've done all those trials. But we did some pretty amazing stuff. So we were able to do one of the first large multi-touch attribution things, which now with deprecation of cookies, it's a different world. But we were able to do that and then really make optimizations and say, how can we look at journeys and work really closely with creative partners around optimization. So when we look at the balance between brand changes and where you invest your money, when we look at creative and media, all three of those things need to be taken into account, not just my media lens and my channels. And data allows you to have those conversations.
Yeah, cool. So you said you had 300 data points, which is way too many. How do you go from 300 to the ones that you actually should be measuring? Because that could drive you crazy, right? Like 300 things going on, you're like, I don't know what should be looking at here.
Oh, 100%. So we established three things, and my team is probably bored of me saying it 6 months, and they've heard me say these things over and over. But we built three things. One was a KPI framework. So there might be hundreds of variables available, but how many matter for this brand and maybe this vehicle line, if I use the GM example, but if you're talking Procter & Gamble, their SKUs, et cetera. What is a KPI framework? And then what is our measurement our measurement framework, which is what are the tools available to us to understand impact. And then that's all anchored in a learning agenda. So a learning agenda are what are those questions that we have as an agency hopefully across agencies, but definitely within media, hopefully within marketing and the business that media can help answer. And if we work well with our creative agencies, how can we answer those and CRM agencies, et cetera? How can we answer those questions as a collective? And if you get it right, you can see how media, creative, et cetera, drives growth. But when you have those artifacts, you understand the KPIs, so people aren't, the creatives aren't saying, okay, it's this KPI, and media saying it's another KPI. You've agreed what the truth is, and you anchor it in the learning agenda. And then as you answer those questions collectively as a team, you say, oh, that KPI, that doesn't actually drive anything. We know that it isn't linked to sales. So one of the projects we were able to do once we established that base was we said, we think there is activity that happens on endemic sites, like car valuation sites, that if someone does it, it's almost as valuable as if they do it on the manufacturer's website, like book a test drive or a car configurator, that type of thing. And so we did the test where we said, let's run activity, let's link it to sales and automotive 3-month delay, at least. Let's measure it. And once we did, we were like, okay, actually, if we push money into these channels, we can drive these sales over time. And there's a strong correlation. So it unlocks our ability to use a variety of levers. And the clients have confidence that we're making good decisions. And yeah, like I said, I was really lucky to have clients that had an appetite for it. We had the budget for it. Not all clients are that lucky. And so it's about taking those foundational elements and saying, based on where a client is at in their journey, what can we use and how can we use that tool set?
Okay. I'd love to dig into the media and creative. You touched upon working with creative agencies and CRM agencies and stuff there. So it's a topic I'm really interested in. A previous guest, Rory Sutherland, said that the decision to separate media and creative was totally deranged. I think he might have put some other words in there that I won't say for this recording as well. But and I kind of agree with him, because the way I think about it is the media should be planned before the creative, because you don't, especially now with so many different media choices. I mean, take a difference between, let's say, The Guardian and TikTok, and the different formats that you might need depending on where your audience are. So how did data that you were building in the media agency help you to work with creative agencies, and how did that sort of collaboration come together to help the client?
Yeah, so I think it's really fascinating, because whether it's the media first or the creative first, the point is you have to have the discussion about what creative works for what channel and vice versa, like what is performing. And if we think about most of the conversations within the client organization and the marketing department and what the CMO care about, they want to understand how their product and their big creative idea resonates with consumers. And yet we generally, I'll make a general statement, it's generally planned in silos, where the big creative idea happens without taking into account necessarily where it's going to land in the media. And is that the right message for that channel? You're absolutely right. The Guardian is completely different than what we put on TikTok or Meta. And so if we think about the balance between those two, data ends up being the leveling force, I think, where you start saying, what does success look like? Is it just saying the message got out there? Because that's probably not what we want. We want the message to get out there, but at the right time and in the right context. And so for us, when it's been successful, and this is why I'm super passionate about collaboration, is that it's about the creative and media agency having those conversations up front. A big idea.
Before the work's done.
Before the work's done and before the media is booked. And so when the creative agency is looking at, like, how are we going to shape this amazing message for a product, if they're having that discussion with the media agency, you're able to come up with something that's better, that says, hey, there's these new formats or these new channels, and here's where our audiences are. How does that inform your creative idea? And frankly, it's really fascinating the amount of push there is on media agencies to optimize, when actually the biggest lever for optimization is your creative. And so, and I say that having done hundreds of thousands of tests on this, and that balance between, do you pull a media lever in your optimization, or do you actually need to look at your creative? And creative performs differently on Google. You need time to bed it in, whereas on other social channels, you need to constantly something new. So depending on the channel and what the message is that you're trying to get across, you have to have really close collaboration.
Yeah, and with the ability to measure attention now as well, your point about creative is we're starting to better prove it, right? So companies like Amplified Intelligence have looked at a format on a publisher and said the floor of attention will be like zero point 0.1. Even if it was a blank white space, it would get that just because of where it is. And the ceiling is 3 seconds. And the difference between whether you get zero point 0.1 or 3 seconds is the creative.
Yes.
That's going to make the difference on how. And I agree with you that media are constantly pushed to optimize, but sometimes you're optimizing with the wrong tool, which is the bit that the consumer cares about, which is the creative.
Yeah, and there. Data to decisions. So within Dentsu, that team has done years of research of MMMs and et cetera, and they had a great piece of work several years ago that was showing brand share in the market is the number one driver, followed by creative, followed by all the other levers that you can pull within media. So if you think about that, yes, you can, and we should be optimizing media, and we should be making sure that we're using that investment wisely. But really, if we're not looking at the creative, we're missing out on one of the biggest levers that we can pull. So, and I think there's some really interesting things that you do, but it requires trust between agencies, which I think has always been a bit of a challenge once media and creative was separated. But that trust in saying, all right, we understand what success is. We're going to work together in the benefit of the client means that you can look at creative variables. There's some really interesting APIs that are now available from Amazon and from Microsoft, which will take your creatives and tag it with the different variables that are in the creative. You can link that to the media data and then understand what variables drove what performance. So if you have enough creative assets and you've done that investment properly up front, and you run it in the right media channels, you can test all the variables and say, hey, we need to do more of X, or the music really made a difference in these video ads, or, our call to action.
Are we talking about DCO here, dynamic creative optimization, or?
It doesn't even have to be within DCO. You can take what is not DCO and say, on your big creative executions, what components worked and what didn't. Right. As long as you have enough variations. Ideally, you do DCO, but DCO requires a lot of creative assets that, and I'm sure we'll get onto AI a little bit later, AI should allow
not to.
Yeah. AI should be able to help create some variations, more variations due to testing. But as long as you're looking at a good amount of creative to begin with, you don't necessarily have to go down the DCO route. It's interesting if I go way back into when I worked in CRM data and database marketing, as it was called. But we would test variables, and we got to the point within, I think it was mailers, that you could get too creepy. You got too detailed. You knew too much about someone. And that actually turned them off from signups. And so we would say there's this middle between it's contextually relevant for them, but it's not so.
And stalker mode.
And then stalker mode. And that's what we have to think about DCO as well, because I think there was a perception if you get it specific enough, that will get your response. And I think media actually needs to play somewhere between, it needs to be relevant, but it doesn't need to be so specific that someone's like, how did you get that data? That's way too much about me. So that's a balance that we need to play. But again, client, creative, and media have to come together, and ideally CRM as well.
Cool. So we're only just getting started, I feel, but that you've packed quite a lot into that already, which is absolutely mind-blowing. It's a phenomenal career to date. Out of all of that stuff so far, obviously there's a lot ahead as well, but what are you most proud of?
I probably that first role in media on General Motors, and I say that because it was this really sweet spot in my life where I had the time to completely go into work, and that's where I spent all my time. But then I also had a client who wanted to do it. I had this opportunity where it was a clean slate, which how many times does that happen with a client account where you say, just scrap everything you've done in the ad server, start from zero. And actually we want to include everything across every media channel. We don't want it just around digital. And I worked with a really good group of people, and I was lucky to have creative partners that wanted to do the same thing. So there was a sweet spot of about 3 years where we were able to do every major project that you would want to do within data and analytics and then embed it into planning, which now, 10, 12 years later that was such a gift because it gave me this depth of experience and a volume of spend that was, I don't know, around $2 billion annually at that point. That was such a volume that you had statistical significance, and it gave me confidence to have conversations that I think it would have taken me 10 years to get if I didn't have that really intense, almost pressure cooker situation. But I'm incredibly proud of what we built, and that allowed me to then go build a global team and build products and have a different type of relationship with clients, I think. So that first role, I think I'm so incredibly proud of the team and what we built.
And on top of all of that, the interview process was less than a day.
Oh my God. Yeah. I've never had, since then it's never been quite that easy. But and I have lots of stories from that those first couple of years in the Detroit team, but absolutely fantastic team. And I think there's still quite a few people working on the account today that were in that transition group.
Yeah. So quite a lot has changed from that first job to today. I think you were probably maybe a year or two into the big data thing as it was growing, and probably the timing for Clean Slate when that was all coming to fruition was amazing. But fast forward to 2024, and then if you look back at what you're doing now versus what you were doing then, a lot's changed. A lot stays the same, but a lot's changed. What are the things that you think have changed the most, and maybe that have changed for the better, and maybe some that maybe haven't changed for the better?
Yeah, so I think on the technology and data front, if you think about what the LumaScape was in 2012 versus what it is now, if you can't even read anything, it's just you have to zoom in at a microscopic level. So where we're talking about 100 and something pieces of technology in 2012, and we're now talking about thousands and thousands now. And so the complexity, there's opportunity in that complexity, but the complexity has exploded. And none of it, like I said, has really been built for agencies to do their jobs. It's been built to facilitate a transaction between a publisher and a client. And so I think the complexity for agencies has gotten exponentially bigger. And I think it's really difficult to understand the detail unless you're a practitioner in the weeds. And so I think we try to simplify it for clients and say, we'll make it all fit and it'll be fine. And I think that was true 10, 12 years ago, but I think it's gotten really hard as things have gotten more complex. And hopefully AI will help with some of that. But when you're talking about transactional data that needs to be linked across hundreds of different platforms, checked for suspicious activity, ensuring that it's delivering the value that you signed up for, it's really complicated. And while AI can help, AI has been trained, especially the ones that are that we talk about the most, ChatGPT, et cetera. It's been trained on language and written word, not on rows and rows of performance data. So there's quite a bit of a gap that still needs to happen where AI can help. But the technology explosion is something that's helpful. I think cookie deprecation will actually help us get back on the right track with measurement. And I say that because with all the data available, we got really obsessed with last touch attribution and the availability of data. It was like, well, the data is available, we'll optimize to that, and we didn't ask the question, is it the right data point? So,
do you think that has a detrimental effect on getting brands signed off? Because the direct response, I mean, there's a famous Airbnb example, isn't there, where they stopped doing all of their direct response, but the hits to their website continued to go up because their brand was so strong.
Yep.
So
100%.
when CMOs are trying to get brand money signed off, and the CFOs looking at it and going, no, let's do this because this is where the money's coming from. It's tough, right?
It's really tough. And we say the money's coming from that because there's an attribution model that tells us it is.
Yeah.
It isn't necessarily the case. Now, in some cases it is, but if you think about a healthy funnel and what levers you need to pull, unless you have a measurement in place to say, actually, the dollar in at the top of the funnel will drive 2x at the bottom, you almost can't get it signed off by CFOs, or it's been harder to get it signed off. And so I think when we think about, and this is part of the reason why I'm so passionate about like the data and having those measurement frameworks, is because if you have it, you give the confidence to the CMO or the marketing team to say, actually, no, we're going to stay the course, and CFO, this is how we're going to measure it. And this is why, actually, if we don't build the top of the funnel, that those search results are going to be more expensive over time. So I think the technological advances that we've had have been great, but they've also created a lot of bad behavior. And we've taken our eye off of what actually drives business results over time, and it's not just search activity. Search is a key component, but there are a lot of brands that have come to us and say, how do I lessen my reliance on search? And that takes time and a bit of patience, and that's really hard in the market today, where there's a lot of we need results tomorrow, and actually building brand takes time and consistency. So it's a delicate balance, but I think having a framework that you believe in on both the client side and the agency side will give you the kind of the backing or the solid base to maybe take a little bit longer to prove things out, as opposed to saying, no, we have to do that tomorrow.
I'm curious as to how you have those conversations with clients. So let's just say this is our framework. We know this works, and it's going to take 6 months, just for illustrations purposes.
Yep.
Well, that's lovely, Kara, but I need it in a month.
Yeah.
How do you have the conversation? So, well, it just doesn't work like that. You can't have it in a month. If you could, we'd do it in a month. You know. How do you have those conversations with clients?
Well, it's a lot of it comes down to saying, what do you need in a month to allow us to have space to do that for longer. So you never get to a perfect solution. There's never a situation where we can say it's going to take 6 months, and clients like, yes, 100%. Fine. We'll go ahead and do that. No hurry at all. So what I found effective, and it's not like it's not every single client that can do this, but it's to say that balance between how do we help you in the short term, drive enough business results that you have the space for us to do the stuff that we know is going to pay off, where that all the research, our hypothesis is that it's going to pay off because all the research tells us that it's right. But it's building that trust with both your immediate stakeholder and the business. So if the business says, you know what, every time they brought a hypothesis and we've given them the space to prove it out, it works. You end up building trust. And it's only when you can establish that trust. And your client isn't just the CMO. It's going to be the CFO as well. And to prove that that relationship out. And when you can do that and follow through, you'll get a lot of benefits and actually a lot of fun, exciting situations that come up within the client's business, because you'll be invited to, I think, broader and different types of conversation. But that comes with trust and proving yourself.
So small wins early, and just keep small wins until you get to the big win, essentially.
Yeah, at 100%.
Cool. So you mentioned the Lumascape and its explosion over the last decade or so.
Yep.
So there's a lot more people in the market that want to speak to your clients, and there's obviously the in-housing phenomenon, if that's the right term. Trend probably is less.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So how have you seen in sort of from those early days working with GM through to leading now, how have you seen the agency relationship with clients change? What does that look like today?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think there have been, depending on which clients you go to, they're looking to bring some things in-house. Then maybe they try it for a bit, and then they say, actually, these pieces we actually want to give back to you. So I think it's about adaptability. If I think about my experiences on the client side, there'll be a centralization activity, and then it'll go back out to the markets, or in the U.S. we had DMAs, but you'd have sub-markets that you would get quote unquote power sent back to, or budget sent back to make decisions. And I think that journey of, is it centralized? Does it go out? Is it dispersed? I think every company is on that journey. There is no one static model. And so agencies have to be adaptable to say, what is that journey and how do we add value? So I think we have to ask questions in a different way. It's not as simple as, okay, we do everything within media and that just sits with us. It's saying, what does the client's internal team do better? Like if they own it, that is close to their brand, their own properties, how do they ensure that tone is right and that message is right? And if you have a really strong brand proposition that you know how to brief your agencies on, it's a little bit safer to outsource more from a client's perspective. If you don't have a good handle on it, or you're in a big period of change, you need to bring that in-house so that it's closer to the product and the message that you're trying to send out. So I think it's on the agencies to say, how do we navigate that changing landscape and be open to changing that landscape? But it requires partnership, which again needs to be anchored in what is the real thing you're trying to drive for your business. Just getting a brief over that says, go buy me some TV isn't probably a good relationship. You need to say, how is TV impacting what you're doing in-house? What are you doing in-house that we could potentially enhance? So I think partnership has to lie at the core of it, but it needs to be flexible. It has to be flexible.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned that AI earlier. We couldn't get by without mentioning it. So I feel with AI that you mentioned ChatGPT as well. It's incredible. It is incredible, but it hallucinates
Yeah.
a lot, and it can't really be trusted yet.
Yeah.
So I'd be really curious to know the sort of where you're at with AI versus where you could be at. In real terms, how much AI is integrated into what you do in media planning and buying today, and where do you think it's going to go?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because the way that the platforms are evolving that we have to use to do media transactions, AI is getting embedded in them. We've done some investments internally within IPG around and media brands around how we use AI and how it's used within strategy and our ability to answer client briefs. But you're absolutely right about the dangers of AI because it's learned on historical information, which we all know is a product of whoever decided to write something down as opposed to maybe what the entire experience is. So if we think, yesterday actually we had a joint workshop with UN Women to talk about AI and gender inequality and how that shows up in media and what we need to do to combat it, because it's a really hairy topic. If you think about the challenges about how women have showed up in documented history, and if that is what AI is learning against, how does that work if you're using that to generate your images, or how is that showing up whenever you're optimizing your campaigns? And there's going to be bias built in. There's loads of examples within product build and technology build where just using AI will create biases in the products that have to be then corrected by humans. So I think our fundamental belief within UM, and I'd probably expand this to media brands and wider IPG, is that AI has to be married with human intelligence on top of it, and we have to be constantly interrogating it. So use AI, but there has to be multiple checks in place to ensure that it is giving us the output that we think is right for the client, but then also the ethical thing to do. And I think this is where people want a quick answer, and AI will just going to solve that, and it's not. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done still.
So you need the human element to understand what you're expecting to see and to check that that's actually what you get, right? Because some of the more primitive uses of ChatGPT I've seen, I'll give you an example. So a friend of mine works in care homes, so he's not in our world at all. And when ChatGPT was fairly new, I said, "Oh, have you heard of it?" And he'd never heard of it, so I showed him. And he's a QPR fan, so I showed him. Look, what you do is you can say, give me a rundown of QPR's season. I think it was 2022, 23 or whatever, and it was all wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, he was quite happy with what he came up with because it made them out to be much better than they were actually doing. But it was all wrong. And now, had you not had a human look at that and go, that's wrong, somebody could have published that.
Well, a human that could look at it and know that it's wrong.
Yes.
So who knew enough to say, oh, that's not right.
Yeah.
That's interesting, but that's not right.
But you imagine if thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of times stuff is published because it's been created by Gen AI and it's been published unchecked by a human. That's now AIs are going to now start feeding off the stuff that's incorrect that's on the internet. We could get to the point where it's basically feeding off its own exhaust pipe, and we end up with a whole shit pile of crap.
Exactly. And I think that, and
this is a technical term anyway.
Yeah. Well, this is the delicate balance because, and it's a really interesting place for me to be, going from having a product and tech role where I was looking at how do we use AI and working with some really great partners in the space, all the big ones, to now saying how do I lead a team that needs to use AI in their day-to-day work, but how do we ensure that we're using it in the right way and we protect? And what I really love about the UM approach has been how to balance human intelligence and technology. But the human lens has to be there. So yes, companies can do massive investments in AI, which is fine, and it makes for great headlines. But when you think about the practical everyday delivery that you need to do for your clients and what's the right thing to do within society and media and the rest of it, it's going to take that human intelligence. And that means that, yes, you need to do some technology investment, but you need to invest in your people. So you need to think about how are you upskilling your teams on what to look out for. Just like a lot of companies have had to invest in phishing education at most companies to say, hey, don't click on that thing that looks suspicious or look for misspelled words. The same thing we're going to have to do with AI. What are those checks in place that you get an answer? How many levels of verification do we need before we use it? And if something that took 10 hours now takes an hour, how are we adding in the additional checks to make sure that maybe it's not 20 hours anymore, maybe it's an hour and a half, or maybe it's 2 hours, and that's acceptable. It's not about immediacy. So there's a balance, and I think everyone's navigating it at the same time, trying to do what's right, but also move at pace. It's tough. It's tough. It's a tough balance.
Yeah. How can you imagine it being used in the future if it will, of course, improve and eventually get to the point where you can trust it, and if you ask it something and it gives you an answer, you think that will be right. How can you imagine media planning and buying sort of changing in the future with advancements in AI?
Yeah, so I 2 years ago now, maybe a little bit longer, I had a great meeting with a Microsoft team that had been involved in the ChatGPT and OpenAI work. And one of the things that they said to me is that the future is going to be less about training engineers and more about asking smart questions. And I think the planning and buying right now, we have a lot of people that are really good at Excel. And the job's going to change, and it's going to be asking the questions that we all want to ask, but we don't have time to. So, or at least ask it more frequently and higher level questions. So I think it's going to change from a lot of the manual work that we have to do today. That's just part of the agency translation of the marketplace to the client way of speaking, and more about asking the important questions and getting faster responses. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but until we figure out how to put those checks in place, we're going to have to go slower, I think, than ideal. But I think in the future, it will allow us to ask deeper questions more frequently than we're able to do today, which is an opportunity. I think it would be massive. I think it'll be interesting to see how it impacts creative. I've seen all of the same stats. I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast will have heard about, generative AI is going to be content will be 95% generative AI in a year's time and all of that. But I think this is where the industry needs to think about what are the checks in place that we do, that we put in at every level. So if I use a simple example from the workshop that we did yesterday, if you put in to an AI program, give me a picture of a doctor, 99% of the time it's going to be a white man. If you talk about give me a picture of a healthy woman, it's probably going to be a white female that's probably actually too thin. So if you think about those impacts of in a few years' time, hopefully we'll have built in the checks in place that will correct the AI to allow us to answer those questions in creative. And in media, we'll have also done that when you talk about audience targeting, channel selection, and we're able to ask bigger questions. But I think we're in what I would probably call the messy middle between it's useful, but is it as usable as we want it to be? I think we're kind of in the middle. But hopefully in the future, we can do less of what I would say is the more, I don't know. I don't want to say no one wants to do it, but it's more of the messy data synthesis and more of the important questions, I think, is opportunity.
Okay. So moving from, we love an acronym, but so moving from AI to MFA, made for advertising sites, and talking about messy. I saw a post a couple of weeks ago from, I think it was Craig Tuck at the Ozone Project, saying that some auditors are now classifying news brands as made for advertising because they rely on advertising, which sounds, I've worked at so many news brands over the years and have the grey hairs to prove it. And I find that staggering. But there was a lot of debate on LinkedIn as a result of that, and a lot of people posting some great thoughts. But it became pretty apparent that we don't actually have a definition of what a made for advertising site is, and what value, if at all, if any, they sort of add to the media landscape. So how would you define a made for advertising site, and do you think they add any value?
So if we think about what we would consider the definition of, a wall of ads that are there, and they're just trying to get some activity to take money from advertisers and not provide value. That's an extreme definition. It's really interesting though, because it depends on how you decide to classify it. Because a content site that does have a lot of advertising, as long as it's useful to the end user, probably shouldn't be classified that way. So I think my view is, if we use it in the most extreme view, it's a wall of ads that provide no value for the end user. But having spent about a year and a half working at a mobile gaming company, what was really fascinating, offer walls, if you put that, that's what it is. It's an advertising wall. You get a value, but it might be coins in a game. Actually work really well for gaming clients. So I think to wholesale put things into boxes. Sometimes we have to look at the context of what the client is. So if I'm thinking of a large brand advertiser, MFAs are 100% not right, and we have to use companies like Double Verify. But that balance of and again, it comes back to data. Are you getting any value from it? If you're not, get it off your plan, block it, and ensure that it's set up appropriately. If you see any value from it, if you get an ROI, fine. But generally, you don't. So I would say generally, don't do that. Like, don't send your traffic there. Put the protections in place. But if you have really good measurement and you can see revenue coming in through it, it might work for you. So I think it depends on the advertiser. But as a general statement, we don't think it's wise to send our advertising dollars in that direction.
Because I've seen various different predictions or estimates rather. Some saying that as much as 15% of open programmatic buying is ending up on these MFA sites.
Yeah.
And if they're providing little or no value to the advertiser, to the consumer, to anybody, that's a huge wasted investment that could be supporting
100%.
like what I would call proper news brands, right?
Yes, absolutely. And this is why measurement is important. So if you have your measurement in place, you should be able to say there is no value there. Cut that out. So I think our default position is to block it, blacklist it, remove it from the plans. But the question is, if an advertiser wants to test it and see if it adds value, let them. But I wouldn't recommend. I think you have to have a really strong data infrastructure where you can see direct revenue to even attempt to go down that path to put your money there. You're willing to test it and see if you can get any value. I think the majority of advertisers, you'd want to blacklist it and ensure you have verification technology in place to make sure that you're not going there. So our default position is don't use it. But in extreme cases like gaming, if you can see your revenue, you might want to test it.
Okay, cool. And finally, that's flown by. That's been 41 minutes, would you believe, already?
Wow.
It's been absolutely enlightening and a real pleasure. But I wanted to ask you what you're most excited about. Now, we're recording this for those listening just before Easter weekend, so it could be something to do with a long weekend and having a bit of a rest, or it could be something about the industry. It's entirely up to you how you interpret the question. But what are you most excited about?
Well, I'm lucky my dad is visiting over from the US, so hopefully we'll have some decent weather this weekend and we can go around and
in England? Yeah, all right. Good luck with that.
Cross our fingers. Cross our fingers. Yeah. Although, fun fact, we learned that it rains more in my home state of Michigan than it rains in the UK, which is always a fun fact. Mm-hmm. But in the industry, I'm really excited about the progress that we're making, and specifically within around this idea of how data-backed decisions can make business differences. And I think I'm only 6 months into my role, but the client conversations that I've had as well is that there's loads of interest and desire for us to have data-informed conversations as opposed to just you're a vendor, go buy some stuff. And I'm really excited about what we can do with that. So a little bit of personal, a little bit of professional.
Yeah, love it. Kara, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that conversation. Thanks very much for giving us your time. And thank you for being on the Six Holes podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.